Jesus, having taught the crowds on the mountainside, and that was probably quite deliberate on Jesus's part, because it was like Moses received from God teaching on the top of the mountain. And so by going to the top of the mountain, commentators often think, was Jesus sending out a signal about the new covenant that was coming with him? Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. So right at the end there, Matthew has recorded the effect that the teaching of Jesus had upon the crowds. Matthew 7 and verse 28. And if we can show the slide, Jordan, where I've got a couple of three translations. In NIV, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. The Message, when Jesus concluded his address, the crowd burst into applause. That's a very lively translation, isn't it? They had never heard teaching like this. And the Passion Translation, by the time Jesus finished speaking, the crowds were dazed and overwhelmed by his teaching. Matthew uses a strong word, if you like. The crowds were knocked out of themselves, would be the quite literal translation. We might say the crowds were knocked for six, blown away, gobsmacked. Pays you money, takes your choice on the translation. But they didn't go away and politely say to Jesus, nice sermon, Vicar. Right? They were blown away by what Jesus had said. Now, Jesus, of course, would have been well aware of the effect that he was having upon the crowd. He would have seen the undivided, edge of the seat attention that they were giving to him. Do you know what? That's every preacher's dream. To see you on the edges of your seat, hanging on the preacher's every word, leaning forward, egging the preacher on. Go on, don't stop, go on, go. Yep. Nah, it's not going to happen. Well, that's the effect Jesus had. See, what we have here and what we know as the Sermon on the Mount is actually Matthew's very brief sermon notes. Matthew 5, 6, and 7, well, you can read it through in a few minutes. It won't take you very long. But they're just abbreviated sermon notes. Jesus would have had lots more to say on each point, starting with the Beatitudes, perhaps. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And he would see some people in the crowd thinking, oh, what do you mean by that? And so he would have explained it to them. He may well have told a story illustrating what he meant to them. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Well, actually, Jesus is there talking about people who are grieved because of their sinfulness. Actually, nothing to do with funerals at all, that verse. Knowing that they are poor in spirit, they are grieved by the sinfulness that's caused that poverty. And so they will be comforted by what? The gospel that comes with a message of forgiveness for their sins. You see, so Jesus, I think, would have expanded on all these points, making sure that the crowds fully understood what it was that he was saying. So, I wouldn't be a bit surprised to learn that this sermon that Jesus preached was at least 2 hours long, if not more. Let's hear it for 2-hour-long sermons. Oh, thank you. But you see, when Jesus was given this teaching, 2 hours must have felt like 10 minutes. You do know that feeling when you look at your watch at the end of a really great sermon and you think, gosh, where's the time gone? And if it's a really rubbish sermon, it might only have been 5 minutes, but it takes an hour. You think it's taken an hour, don't you? You can have, time can be a funny thing, our perception of it like that. Now, preaching like that I'm putting to you is probably what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, it can have disastrous results for the preacher. You see, their egos can become inflated as they milk the adulation of the crowds. Think Donald Trump at one of his rallies. Yeah, they're soaking it up. But for Jesus, the wondering amazement of this knocked for six crowd, well, it would have been like water off a duck's back to him. Jesus would have derived no egotistical pleasure for it. What Jesus was looking for, the satisfaction that Jesus sought, was changed lives. Not just that they were amazed at how great a preacher he was, but that they would do something about it. And that's where this parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount comes in. Because I think sensing this adulation, this amazement, this knocked for sixness, he then says this. Now listen up. Every one of you who's heard these words of mine and puts them into practice, is like the wise man who built his house upon the rock. All right? I might have been, a great speaker, but that's nothing without it doing something. And if you've heard these words of mine and you agree, wow, that was some sermon, but you go home and do absolutely nothing about it, you get the point. My daily Bible reading notes last week took me to the letter of James, who was probably half-brother, if you like, of Jesus. And I wonder, did he have this parable of Jesus in mind when he wrote, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves? What? Do what it says. Now, I may have told you this before. It's the story of a preacher who, at his church, Sunday after Sunday, preached the same sermon. Oh, Jackie's horrified at the thought. And after a while, there were sort of murmurings in the congregation. Do you know what murmurings in the congregation are? Just like that, yeah. People getting fidgety, what's going on here? And so, of course, the church leadership, the deacons in the case of a Baptist church, they thought they better, have a chat about it. And somebody was deputized to go and speak to the pastor about the fact that he wasn't doing his job properly and that he was selling them short by preaching the same sermon Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. Do you know what he said to them? He said, I will preach and I'm preaching. Well, that's brave, isn't it? But you see the point he was making. He was aware that people were hearing it but not doing it. And he felt the only way he could make that point with some force was to do what he did. Have I told you that story before? Actually, I have. Well, not all of you may have been here, so I'll tell it again next week. Back to this parable, there are a couple of things I'd like us to take note of, if you like. First of all, well, there are two houses. There are two builders. But perhaps we can say there was only one storm. You see, sometimes the impression can be given that coming to faith in Jesus, being a Christian, means that you are somehow exempted from the storms of life. And that sort of thinking lies behind comments that I've often heard, well, if God loves me like you say he does, why has this disaster, why has this tragedy hit me? There's the feeling that, shouldn't I be exempt from that? There's not the slightest hint in the teachings of Jesus that faith in him means that you can therefore expect to sail untroubled through life. Faith in Jesus does not ward off troubles. Arguably, and there are verses to back this up, Jesus said they're more likely. What he's saying is that faith in me, faith in Jesus, provides a solid foundation to withstand the troubles and the storms as and when they come. Now again, I know I've used this illustration before, but I often think of an umbrella. And I've said this many times as a hospital chaplain to people at the bedside. And I said, do you know what? You go out, you got your umbrella, and it starts to rain. And you think, fat lot of good my umbrella is, it didn't stop it raining. And so you throw it away. Now what do you do when it rains? You put the umbrella up to stop the rain falling on you. That's what Christian faith does. Christian faith is, oh, it's raining, fat lot of good this faith is. Yeah. No, you have the faith for when it rains. Faith isn't some sort of magic formula to stop it raining on you. In this parable, the same storm hits the person who's built his or her life on the words of Jesus as well as the one who has not. The difference is what happens afterwards. One house still stands, whereas the other one has gone. And it's that message that is sounded in the notes that the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity have given us for this Sunday. Let me quote from it. It says, following Jesus is not offered as prevention against the storms we might face in our lives or on our front lines, but we can be confident that lives built on Jesus stand firm. So, in this Sunday in Lent, what is our confidence grounded on? Well, the answer in this parable, of course, is in the words, the teaching of Jesus. And that means not just this Sermon on the Mount, although there's plenty in that, but on all the teaching of Jesus. And all the teachings of Jesus means all of the Old Testament. Hang on. Hasn't Jesus said in this very sermon that the Old Testament has been superseded? You know, you have heard it said, and then he quotes from the Old Testament, but I say to you, Actually, Jesus didn't set out to overturn the authority of the Old Testament, but to tell us its true meaning and application. He came to fulfill it. This is what Jesus says. Don't think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, because that's what some people were thinking when they heard him say. No, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law, referring to the Old Testament, until everything is accomplished. And so then in this Sermon on the Mount, he then explained how this applied to what the Old Testament said about murder, adultery, divorce, the taking of oaths, justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and love. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I'm just thinking, in my prayers just now, did I give you a chance to pray for people that don't like you? I didn't, did I? Something we easily miss, isn't it? Somebody who's got it in for you. Do you pray for them? No? Well, perhaps we should. Yeah. And that, what Jesus says is important. You see, when Jesus was quoting the Old Testament, he would say, "It is written." Yeah? And then a quote from the Old Testament would come. Here on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You have heard it said," not "it is written." In other words, what Jesus is doing here, he's quoting to them what they've been taught by the Pharisees, the Old Testament said. You've heard them say, love your neighbor, yes, and hate your enemy. That's not in the Old Testament. You have heard it said, you shall not murder. So you've not killed anyone. But I say to you about the anger in your heart, the lust within the heart when it comes to adultery. So Jesus is making a clear distinction about what you have heard said and what the scriptures actually mean. So when Jesus says, build your life upon what I say, he's asking us to build our lives on what the Old Testament says, but as interpreted by Jesus, which is the correct interpretation, what God originally meant anyway. And so after the resurrection, he said to his disciples, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. The Old Testament points to Jesus. And then there's the rest of the New Testament. The opening words of the Acts say this: "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote all about that Jesus began to do and teach." The former book was Luke's Gospel. Now then, if that was what Jesus began to do and teach, then the implication is that now in Acts and through his church, it's what Jesus continues to do and teach. So the teaching of the apostles is also coming from Jesus. So that's why I say, building our lives, being the wise builder, the whole of the Bible is what is in mind. And understanding it correctly, build your life on that. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, we are told that those who had newly come to faith on the day of Pentecost, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. The Passion Translation puts it like this: every believer was faithfully devoted to following the teaching of the apostles. Their hearts were mutually linked to one another. That's an interesting understanding of fellowship, isn't it? It's not just a cup of tea and a biscuit at the end of the service. That might express fellowship, but it doesn't exhaust what fellowship is. Sharing communion and coming together regularly for prayer. Luke says they devoted themselves. They were constantly diligent in it. It wasn't a part-time hobby for these Christians. This devotion to these things was their life. The apostles' teaching, the New Testament, the fellowship, what it meant to be truly church. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at what it meant to be the community as a church together, giving confidence to each other. The breaking of bread, what we now call communion, was part of a bigger shared meal. We get that from the letter to the Corinthians, for instance. And actually, Luke wrote in the plural, they were devoted to the prayers, capital S. Prayer in all its forms. Whether it was individual prayer, gathering together for prayer in the synagogue for these Jews in prayer, or even at the temple. Peter and John went to the temple to pray when they met the lame man on the way, remember? So a shared, diligent, consistent commitment to such things builds us up in our faith and equips us then with confidence when we are called upon to give a reason for the hope that we hold dear. A couple of weeks ago, we held our covenant service. Those who are here will remember that. In which we promised to God and each other to continue to aspire to such things as are mentioned in Acts 2 and verse 42. The Lord's heart will be blessed if he sees that those weren't just words that we recite, but were words that we truly meant. When I sent out the email on Friday, I attached to it something of Tom's story, remember, and how he bookended the day, how he began with prayer and scripture reading, and how at the end of the day he looked back on the day with prayer. And the LICC readings say this: the morning time gave him confidence and direction for the day ahead, and the evening an opportunity to reflect. And so this question is put to us: what practices are shaping you as a disciple? We go through different seasons in life. It can be hard when you've got young children at home to have those regular committed times. I can remember I used to put in my diary TWG, and I'd go off in the car, find somewhere nice overlooking a mountain or a valley, and pray there, because, well, home was, be noisy with 3 boys and their mother. And I always remember when Helen saw my diary and saw through my diary those initials, TWG. Who's that? Of course, it stood for time with God. Yeah, but I remember one occasion I went to one of the car parks that I like to go to have my time with God. And it was a lovely sunny day. And I began praying and I closed my eyes. Half hour later, I woke up, said, "Sorry, Lord, amen," because I had to get somewhere else quick. Yeah. It's life, isn't it? Yeah. So don't beat yourself up about it, But still, I ask the question, what are you doing to try and build it into your life? Because such things give us the confidence that we need in our faith if we're to be effective witnesses to start. So is there something that God might be prompting you to start this day? And so OTY, which is a new one on me, it means over to you. If you use text speak, OTY, over to you.